back.
Yep.
Today we're welcoming our guest, Professor Jason Barr. He's a professor at Rutgers, Newark, and he specializes in skyscrapers and how they affect cities.
So in today's episode, we're going to talk about some of the professor's solution to the housing crisis that we've seen in New York City, some changes to zoning regulations that we've seen, and then we ended it off by talking about his idea for expanding New York City into New Manhatta, and then we just ended it off with getting to know the professor a little bit more.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoy.
We certainly learned a lot, and we hope you guys learned just as much.
Yep.
And where am I? Am I looking at you guys or looking at?
Oh no, at us.
Right.
We're not Stephen Colbert.
Right.
As we were looking through your work, I guess the one question that stood out was, why do we need skyscrapers, specifically in New York and around the world?
The answer is urbanization. I mean, New York City has maybe 8.5 million people. Mm-hmm. The New York City metropolitan region is close to 20 million people. And historically, much of the employment base has been concentrated in Lower Manhattan. So, New York City has like maybe 4 million jobs, and a lot of those are just concentrated in Lower Manhattan and Midtown. So, historically, the question is, how do you accommodate all these people who want to be at the same place at the same time? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you just walking here from the subway. I mean, this is a hopping neighborhood we're in, right? So people want to be here, So all this new construction is just to accommodate people who want to be here, mm-hmm. Whether it's, Dumbo, downtown Brooklyn, Manhattan. So in a way, I think of skyscraper as a kind of like, maybe accordion is the wrong word, but it's expanding the city vertically. Mm-hmm. It's just a way for people to be in the city. I mean, if you didn't go tall, all these people who want to be here, where are they going to go? They can't be here. So.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of basic, but that's really what it's about.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I don't know, that's a controversial statement, actually, because when you start talking about tall buildings, you'd be surprised how. I'm really shocked that people get really, they get worked up when you start talking about the need for tall buildings in cities.
Well, do you see them more as being kind of like a functional tool, and with that comes, I guess, like the flashier aspect of them is like when people think of New York, they think of like our skyline. Do you think that comes in first or second in terms of?
Okay, so it's clear that first comes, you have a big city, you have a lot of people, you have a lot of jobs, a lot of economic growth. Then the tall buildings come. Mm-hmm. But people look at the tall buildings and they think, they see a lot of money being spent, they see how flashy they are. You can't have the flash and the spectacle and and the ego and the vanity height and all this kind of stuff without first having a strong fundamental economic base. Mm-hmm. I mean, no matter where you look around the world, it's true. The bigger cities have more tall buildings than the smaller cities. Mm-hmm. And the bigger cities have higher buildings than the smaller cities. Mm-hmm. There's on Twitter today. It was kind of funny. So some tweet, some guy, I don't know. He got his back up about the following fact. So there's this guy in Oklahoma City. He wants to build the skyscraper. He wants to build the tallest skyscraper in the United States. Yeah. Like 1,907 feet. It was symbolic height. I think that's the year Oklahoma joined the Union or something like that. Mm-hmm. So he saw my quote in the Wall Street Journal, which said it's just too tall for that city. Right. And he said some like trolling tweet about how could this quote unquote expert say the building is too tall? He's an expert on skyscrapers and he's trying to say it's too tall. I said, well, if you look at that city's population, mm-hmm. and you look at how tall they're proposing, the gap between the height of the building relative to the city's population is just unprecedented outlier. Mm-hmm. Tall buildings go in big cities. Yeah. So it's very unlikely that project will be approved. It's approved. Actually, they gotten planning permission. Mm-hmm. Whether it's actually completed and economically successful is very highly unlikely. But he missed the point I meant with that quote. It's not that cities shouldn't have more tall buildings. It's tall buildings belong in the cities that need them the most, like New York. Today, like London, or and then you got Hong Kong and then Shanghai and stuff like that.
So you think like in an area like Oklahoma, they would have a tough time finding the demand for it, or it's just like unnecessary there?
Well, the thing is, these things are incredibly expensive to build. You know, something like the Brooklyn Tower, which is behind us, is probably, I don't know, probably $2 or $3 billion to construct. So if you're going to construct that, you have to generate. If you're going to construct it, you're doing that on the assumption or the belief that you can generate enough revenue that over maybe 10 or 15 years you'll earn enough money to pay it back, and then you start earning pure profit. You know, it's just to get a return on your investment. So if you're going to pay $2 billion in Oklahoma City to build the tallest building in the United States, you got to earn the rents and the sales prices to generate it. The only other way it could possibly work in a city like Oklahoma City is if the developer manages to get most of the building filled, so that it's generating more or less enough revenue to keep it operating successfully, but owns the land nearby. Then those land values can shoot up because people will love to have an apartment with a view of an iconic tower and things like that. So if the spillovers, if the guy owns the land, I don't know if he owns how much surrounding property, but if he owns a lot of surrounding property and that tower is successful, then it could generate a lot of money for the neighboring properties.
And so in the current environment, do you think there's a reluctance to build more skyscrapers? And if there is that from developers worrying about their revenue in the future? Or is it from people who live in the cities pushing back against skyscrapers?
Well, developers they build, right? And you can see, you know, downtown Brooklyn and these neighborhoods where there's a huge demand, they'll find a way to build. Now we're in a sort of a tricky economic climate because you have high interest rates, the office market is a little bit soft, but the demand for residential buildings here in the city is huge. So that's not really the problem per se. It's there's a couple of issues. One is the zoning regulations. You know, you can only really build in some specific neighborhoods like downtown Brooklyn or in Manhattan. Those are neighborhoods that are sort of more or less open for tall buildings. The rest of the city is very highly restricted in what you can build because of the zoning regulations. The zoning regulations basically limit how much, more or less, without going into the weeds of this, more or less how much you can build, how tall you could build.
Well, we did want to get into the weeds specifically on zoning regulations because
Yeah.
as we were reading a lot about this stuff, we saw that in the 1960s
Right.
there was a shift in zoning. 'Cause
Exactly.
the city was concerned about
Right.
overpopulation. Are those the same zoning restrictions?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So, I think it's a really interesting history. But so in 1916, the city implemented its first set of zoning rules, which limited. One of the things it did was, as buildings got taller, they had to be set back. So it gave shape to the sort of wedding cake style buildings, like the Empire State Building, Chrysler Building. There are various reports which have different numbers, but by and large, let's just say the lowball estimate was if New York City had been fully built out under the 1916 zoning codes, at least in the 50s, it would have held like 55 million people, because those building regulations, while they had regulations, to limit it, they were relatively loose, because this was the first time that any big city was trying to limit some property rights, and back in 1916 to limit property rights was a kind of a new thing, so they were worried about that. But then by 1961, they were they started to attempt to what's called down zone, which is limit the building area. They started to do that really in the 30s, but for many reasons, it didn't finally pass until 1961. So that's when they had a major down zoning. So it went from 55 million as a theoretical possibility to 12 million. Right. And so we're more or less dealing with the same rules. Now Bloomberg, when Bloomberg was mayor, he kind of moved the chess pieces around, in the sense that some neighborhoods out, like in the Bronx and Queens, they were downzoned. These residential neighborhoods were made more difficult. But downtown Brooklyn was upzoned, and then you had like the Hudson Yards and the High Line. So, in some sense, Bloomberg took the 1961 zoning codes and kind of reshaped them actually to create more skyline pockets, but keep everything else relatively low rise.
So we wanted to concentrate the growth in specific areas.
Yes, exactly. That was the deal. That was the grand bargain. Because you can't start. It's very difficult to tell people, like, you know, you go out into Queens. I don't know how much you travel out there, but you know, once you get towards Nassau County, for example, it's all just 1 and 2 family homes. You can't. It's politically explosive to start saying we're going to put up apartment buildings, you know, 10-story apartment buildings. Even though you go out there and you got the Long Island Railroad, it would be perfect, you know, to create apartment buildings right along the railroad. But it's not zoned for that.
Do you think that the new rezoning changes that have been made under Bloomberg and maybe even after that have affected the housing crisis in any way?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you should say that, because in the last couple of months, I think it was in the New York Times, there was this like big headline, reevaluating Bloomberg's rezoning. And so this idea of him downzoning these outer neighborhoods now is getting pushback.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a double-edged sword what he was doing, but he couldn't have put through these major upzonings in the central neighborhoods without kind of getting everyone on board. And those, he had to get the people out in the suburbs on board, or the suburban areas in New York City on board. So today, Mayor Adams, he's proposing what they call, you know, City of Yes plan. And so that's to, you know, get rid of minimum parking, upzone in certain neighborhoods. So try to add a little bit of housing everywhere throughout the city. So everybody's supposed to presumably do their fair share of adding more housing.
And how adaptive is that system? Is it the mayor who can propose a plan and then people need to review it, or community leaders need to review it?
Everybody reviews it. So you got the community boards, you know, so you basically put this proposal together, then you have these community boards, which there's community districts. Every borough has several community districts. They're large neighborhoods, and so they have a lot of input. You know, they don't have any like strong power other than, you know, they might, you know, you have your city council members. So, you know, the mayor proposes some ideas, has to work its way through city planning and city planning commission, and then it will go through the like the legislative process. So there's many many, you know, hands in the cookie jar.
Yeah, and I know you talked about, I think on your blog you were talking about like the yes in my backyard versus the no.
Oh right, yeah.
Ideas. I wonder, like, what role does that play in this?
Okay, so you know the phrase NIMBY, not in my backyard. So this is this kind of sort of phrase for this idea that, oh, everybody in theory is open to the idea that the city needs more housing. It's just they don't want it in their neighborhood. So they're, you know, they're kind of tagged these NIMBYs. And so, you know, there was a response maybe, I don't know, maybe a decade ago where basically millennials, mostly younger people who felt like they're living in cities that are just way too expensive. So they sort of formed you know, different groups, YIMBY groups, yes in my backyard. And so there's this kind of YIMBY movement. But the thing is, you know, they're trying to get more affordable housing. But at the end of the day, the forces of preventing new housing in the city is just really strong. It's just the whole city is sort of designed to build as few houses as possible.
Do you see skyscrapers and like high-rise buildings as being an optimal solution for that kind of problem?
I mean, okay, it's not a one-size-fits-all. You know, if people think, oh, I'm pro skyscraper, I must be, you know, skyscraper is, you know, it's not a hammer that, you know, like people think, I think that skyscraper is a hammer that, you know, solves all, like, whatever problems. Tall buildings work in the center where the land values are the highest, where most people want to hang out. But out in, as you get further and further out of the city, it's more rational and reasonable to have, you know, to convert one-family houses to two-family houses, or convert two-family houses to small apartment buildings. Along the subway line, if you ride the subway, whether it's like up into the Bronx or out into Queens, you'll see there's like one two-family houses, low-rise buildings along the near the subway stop. That doesn't make any sense. You should have, you know, 10 or 15-story apartment buildings, what they call transit-oriented development. Yeah, so what makes sense is to have flexibility based on, you know, the character, both the character of the neighborhood and the land values and the market rents. So out in the suburbs, there should be just more flexibility. If a single-family homeowner wants to add what they call an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, maybe convert a garage to a rental, or subdivide their house so that the upper floors, something that's a perfectly reasonable response out there. Along the subway lines, out in the Bronx, maybe 10, 15-story buildings. Here in Manhattan, in downtown Brooklyn, 30, 50-story buildings make a lot more sense.
Have other large cities like London or Tokyo found any policies?
Well, Tokyo has been pretty well known for being really quick on adding new units, and so.
Is that because they don't listen so much to pushback from, like we said, NIMBY groups?
Yeah, exactly. They first of all, as I understand it, I don't profess to be an expert on Tokyo, but the zoning and the planning comes from the sender.
Yeah.
Here, remember, everything is done at the city level. So once you get out of, once you cross over the border from, let's say, Queens to Nassau County, or Brooklyn, or Bronx to Westchester County, out in the suburbs there's hundreds of these small towns and villages, and they all shape their own plan. So it's like New York is almost has this kind of sort of invisible wall. On the other side of the wall, it's impossible. It's even harder for anything to get done. If you think of the metropolitan region has 20 million people, but it's only the 8.5 million people where there's some flexibility. The rest are all kind of stuck, in towns where it's really hard to build. So I don't know if that gets to your question or not.
No, it does.
So the part of the problem is if it's a very decentralized zoning and land use and housing is a very decentralized process because we live in a very decentralized municipal area. I mean, the United States is municipally very decentralized. So the more decentralized it is, the more each town has its own desire, and then if you have a lot of single-family houses, then it's just the people who get elected to run these little town, the mayor of this small town, or the board of trustees, they're just going to look out for the homeowners, and they're going to do what they can to stop.
Is it a concern for, if we take countries internationally, like we said, Tokyo and maybe China as a second example? I know that a lot of their infrastructure in terms of highways and skyscrapers, public transit, is accelerating at a much faster rate, and like you said, because they listen to less pushback. Is it a concern for America in the next 10 to 20 years that engineering and whether it's skyscrapers or high-speed transit, is that something that's going to continue to fall behind? Is there a solution?
Well, it's not the engineering. I mean, these things are known. I mean, they take congestion pricing. I mean, Governor Hochul cancels it 2 or 3 weeks before it was supposed to go into effect. Congestion pricing is a known entity. There are many cities around the world that have been congestion pricing for many years. They know exactly how it works and that it does work. So the problem isn't the engineering. The problem is, again, political leaders are really too, there's two ways to look at it. They're too afraid of, or they're either too afraid, or if they do show initiative, they'll just get pushback from the constituents. So the problem is this whole NIMBYism thing has a lot of, there's a lot of sway or control from groups that are not interested in seeing change. Because, from the point of view, you buy a home, for example, it's perfectly rational to stop change. I mean, you paid, maybe $1 million for your home, or $800,000 for your home. And so you want to make sure that, your home values are preserved, the schools are exactly the way you moved with your family to have certain schools exactly the way it is, the parks you want to, so you don't want anything to change, because that's what you bought into. And so there's this idea that, this is my package, my neighborhood package, my housing package, and anything you're proposing frightens me. So, this is a problem we have to overcome. You have trade-offs. People, maybe they like their neighborhoods the way they are, but that's just going to stop them from doing things like congestion pricing. I mean, high-speed rail is a definite thing. But the way to benefit high-speed rail, for example, is to run a high-speed rail line, let's say through Grand Central, Penn Station, go up out to the the leafy areas of Westchester, or out in Suffolk County. Imagine you run a high-speed rail and you connect those to the metropolitan region. people have more affordable housing because it'll be out there where the land values are cheaper. But you can't build out there. So without people and communities on board to expand their neighborhoods or expand their towns, then there's no purpose in building high-speed rail, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what are incentives that could bring the naysayers into being in agreement with skyscrapers?
Well, I would say not to say well, there's two issues. There's the skyscraper, which is kind of one issue, but the naysayers be on board on saying let's have more housing in our neighborhoods. That's really the more fundamental problem. Literally 50% of New York City land, residential land, the zoning, which the zoning rules tell you what you can do with the land and how much you can build on the land. 50% of the land that's restricted for residential is 1 and 2 family homes. If you just convert it, so I think there's something like 500,000. Okay, there's something like I think about 500,000 units in 1 family and 2 family homes in New York City, something like this, right? Yeah. If they doubled that, that's 1 million units. You could solve the housing problem. I think there's something like 300,000 single family homes. If every single family home became a 2-family home, you would literally
solve the housing crisis.
You could solve the housing crisis.
Right.
So the problem is every neighborhood really has to, add 20%, 30%, 40% more housing. Here's the, so for example, there's rent stabilization. There's 1 million rent stabilized buildings, units. So one out of.
Doesn't that only apply to buildings built before a certain year?
No, not necessarily, because there's a lot of most of the rent stabilization stock is from buildings that were built like before World War II or before. I'm not exactly sure, but most of it is old housing that used to have rent control and then became rent stabilized. Yeah. But a lot of the housing programs today says if you want to have some these tax break programs or these mandatory inclusionary housing where the tax break programs say you can get a tax break for 30 years. You build this new building, you get these tremendous real estate tax breaks over like 30 years, but on the condition that you add, if your rental building is a rental building, like it has to be rent controlled or rent stabilized, or some of the units have to be rent stabilized. So they're constantly, maybe it's not a lot in terms of the new units, the fraction of rent stabilization, new rent stabilization that comes online. Maybe it's not a lot. I have to look into the numbers, but they're adding more to the rent stabilization stock because you take advantage of these tax breaks or these programs that are designed to encourage new housing, but also provide some affordable units. But the rent stabilization, the Rent Guidelines Board declares a rental emergency if the citywide housing vacancy is less than 5%.
Okay.
So the city's never had a vacancy rate above 5%.
Why is it a state of emergency?
That's the definition. So the rent control board or the rent stabilization board says if the housing vacancy rate is less than 5%, then rent stabilization remains in effect. But rent stabilization, you can't. It causes low vacancy, and so in some sense, it's sort of just perpetuating this low vacancy. It's self-perpetuating the crisis. Do you know what I'm saying? So if the city built where like literally, if the city city needs to build its way out of this by making sure city vacancy rate is greater than the housing vacancy. If the housing vacancy was 7%, today it's 1.4% citywide. Housing rental vacancy is 1.4%. That's basically like it's impossible to find.
Yeah.
If the city vacancy rate was 5 or 7%, there would be no housing crisis. People could find units when they wanted at reasonable prices. So if you want to solve a housing crisis, you say, okay, how do we get the citywide vacancy up to 5, 6, 7%?
Is there like a realistic path forward to converting the single-family and two-family houses?
California has a law that allows some neighborhoods to convert their single-family houses to ADUs, and so there's some success with that. So that's a possibility. Just basically saying if you want to convert your garage, you just fill out some paperwork and you go through some bureaucratic hoops. So that won't necessarily solve the crisis, but it certainly help. I mean, if it'll help. For example, senior citizens who want to downsize, like let's say they have a husband and wife, they have a couple of kids, but the kids move to a new house, and let's say a widow, the mother's living by herself in the big house. She wants to downsize, she can move into the converted garage, and that frees up the house for somebody else.
Right.
So, that's how housing works. I mean, if you build new housing, it frees up the other housing for other people. So you just got to keep building enough housing so that it keeps freeing up.
Mm-hmm. And I think a popular idea.
This is my beverage.
Yes, this.
Okay.
I think a popular idea I've seen online is people suggesting that some of the new available real estate that freed up because of the pandemic, moving businesses away from being in office, converting some of that real estate into housing. Do you think that idea has any potential?
Okay, so so the question is whether converting offices to residential has potential, and the answer is yes and no. It's a great idea. The economics of it don't always work out, especially with these buildings, in the 70s and 80s, these big floor plans. You have to change the rules too. So first of all, they're moving very slowly to change the rules. Second of all, these big buildings with large floor plans, the economics of it don't quite work out because you may have to add a light shaft in the center, because what happens is you really can't have more than 30 feet between the window and, let's say, the wall. So then if you have 100 feet or 60 feet between the window and the corridor or the elevator, you have a lot of this internal dead space that's just dark. So
are those lighting regulations?
I think they're combined lighting regulations. It's just the economics of it, that people don't want these big dark spaces. So the conversion is very expensive just if you have the ideal conditions. So there's not every building is well suited. I mean, if the zoning changes and the rules changes, that you can allow like all kinds of cubicles or shops or something in these dead spaces, maybe you can make the economics of it work that way. So back when they originally started talking about converting the offices, I think Adams had some number of like 20,000 units can be created from converting offices to residential. And again, there's 3.6 million housing units in New York City, so 20,000 or even 30,000 is a drop in the bucket. So I think it's good for the city to try to encourage as much conversion, because you don't want these empty buildings. You want to get these buildings back, on the tax rolls. You want the neighborhoods to remain vibrant. So it's great to create like the 24-hour city and all that kind of stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, going back to incentives to change the naysayers and to being encouraged towards building skyscrapers.
Yeah.
It's difficult not to mention Billionaires Row in
Right.
the city.
Right.
And one building in particular that I'm fascinated by is 111 West 57th.
Yeah.
You can't miss it in the skyline. But the thing is, as you learn and you hear about it, it's effectively all very highly priced residential spaces.
Right.
And I think that when people, like when the regular New Yorker looks at something like that, it seems inaccessible to them.
Right.
So is there a way to make skyscrapers affordable to the average person?
Well, it depends what you mean by the word skyscraper. I mean, in China, I don't know if you guys have been to China. You guys spend 5 minutes in China, and you'll see tall buildings are the norm for the middle class.
Right.
So they tried to make public housing here for the lower classes, and you wouldn't call it a skyscraper. You might call it a mid-rise or a high-rise. The problem wasn't the cost. It was very inexpensive to build these things, because the economics of building sort of like pared down but tall buildings in like large complexes, it can work very well. If you have planning and you're just taking advantage of economies of scale, you could create a large kind of planned high-rise estate reasonably affordable, to make it reasonably affordable for the middle class. With public housing, what happened was all these policies that they were doing, with public housing, they did slum clearance, they took away, they basically destroyed neighborhoods that seemed gritty but were actually actually had.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by public housing?
Public housing this is housing that was built by the government and is owned by New York City, NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so like Section 8 residences.
No, Section 8 is different because that's like a housing. I think that's a housing voucher program. But that's different. Public housing is housing that was literally built, owned, and operated by a government agency.
Okay. Right.
So, starting in the Great Depression, and really up until the 1970s, hundreds of governments across the cities across the United States, with support from the federal government, built hundreds of thousands of mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings, like that one over there. I'm sure those are NYCHA buildings.
NYCHA,
okay,
there. Exactly.
So they did this in the 50s and the 60s. But what happened is they, by design, they said, okay, so they're going to be low cost, fine. But then they decided they were going to concentrate. They said only the poorest of the poor can be eligible for the housing. And remember, the 50s, 60s, and 70s was when New York City was and other big industrial cities were losing its job base. So they're putting all these housing for poor people online just at the time when employment opportunities were evaporating. Right. So public housing concentrated poverty. It made neighborhoods worse. It increased crime, and it really gave public housing in this country a very bad. Very bad. Not only reputation, but gave people, they destroyed their neighborhoods, created very unhealthy areas. So that gave people in this country this really negative perception about high-rise housing for middle and lower-income people. So, in a way, all the high-rises that you see for the wealthy are in part because that's the only part of the market where it's actually acceptable to build high-rise housing. The idea of building poor high-rise housing is unacceptable from the American perspective because they associate with all the ills and all the problems that happen with public housing.
So a mid to high-rise building isn't inherently a luxury?
No. It's only luxury because, it's super tall, it's super skinny. So those are luxury by design, but not every tall building has to be for billionaires.
Right.
Like I was saying, if you spend any time in China, Hong Kong, tall building after tall building, Hong Kong is this tiny city-state. Same thing with Singapore. They don't have a lot of land. So everybody lives in some form of multifamily, which ranges from probably 10 stories to 50 stories. Right. Everybody. Yeah. There's in Hong Kong and most of China, there's no such thing as single-family houses. So,
have there been any problems for China in terms of because I know that a lot of the growth is recent.
Right.
Did they overbuild and now there's an issue with high rises or lighting?
No, well, the issue really has to do with the overbuilding, but the overbuilding has a lot to do with some very unique features of the Chinese economy. So, in 1978, the Communist Party, they're the only game in town, right? So they run the whole government, at every level. The only way to be a municipal official or a leader is to first, when you're young, join the party. So I don't know, to make an analogy, which is not quite bad. Let's say the government only had Democrats or only had Republicans. And the only way to get a job was first you become a member of the party, and then the party bosses or the party leaders decide where you're going to get a job and how you're going to get promoted. That's the way it works in China. The Communist Party runs the government. So after they began the economic reforms in 1978, before that there was no private property. So in the 80s they decided that every municipal government is going to own all the land. but the local officials, they sell the land leases. They sell the rights to develop the land, and then they collect the money for the government. So there was this kind of incentive to keep building, because you can get more money, and there's a lot of interest in homeowners who want to live in these apartment buildings and they want to buy their units. And so there's a lot of factors about the Chinese economy that just created this incentive to keep building. And so the developers, they just kept building and not really worried about it.
We touched on something similar. Our very first episode that we did for the podcast, it was about how because certain districts within China are incentivized to report higher GDP, they overstated, and then satellite data showed that the lights didn't correspond to the growth that they were showing.
Exactly.
Right. That's true, and it's likely true. And part of this is because, again, let's say you're a local official at a small city, you want to get promoted. So you have to display, whether on paper or in reality, all of the benefits, all the great things you did. And so then the officials above you will look and say, oh, this guy, he's great. He did a lot of great things for the city, so we'll make him an official at a bigger city. And so to get promoted within the party, you really have to keep going. And in this case, and the other problem is it was not in China. The only thing is not only the building, but then they had all these lockdowns, and then that stopped the economy. And then after the Chinese government tried to rebuild the economy, people had lost confidence. They were worried. So there was this sort of post-COVID kind of like fear, and people started saving their money. They stopped investing in houses. They stopped going shopping, stuff like this. And so at some point it realized that both the combined desire to keep building high-rise apartments all across China, combined with a slowdown in buying housing and other economic consumption, things like this, it just created an economic problem for China, which they're kind of dealing with now.
Were you ever worried when we were, not in the beginning of the lockdown, but as COVID progressed, did you ever think that skyscrapers might become a thing of the past?
Not really. And the only reason is this. If you believe that cities will keep going, then you will always see skyscrapers. So skyscrapers, people have a hard time believing this, but it's the truth. Skyscraper growth follows urban growth. It's where people go to be indoors at the same place. So first you need the people to show up. Then when the people come, you build taller. Now, yes, occasionally you can do a super tall tower that becomes a monument and is trying to regrow an area or brand an area, stuff like this. But those are actually the big super tall statement pieces. They're relatively rare. People focus on them because they're easy to see. But statistically speaking, they're a tiny fraction of tall buildings.
Well, post-lockdown, with the rise of remote work, has that had any impact on housing preferences and any urban planning that goes on in the city?
That's a good question. What happens during COVID is just people were fleeing the city. And so in the outer ring, you saw this huge run-up in prices. Yeah. So in the outer ring, like the suburban areas, there's very little, the housing market is terrible. So what happened is here in the city, the reason why vacancy is 1.4% is in part because what happens is COVID stopped building, but then after, during COVID there was lack of new construction, and then after COVID kind of eased off, people sort of came back into the city, and so there wasn't the supply to keep up with the demand, and so the real big effect, which will dissipate over time, but it will take time, is that normally every year you have a certain amount of churning. Certain people move because of either they want to move to a different neighborhood, they get a new job, or just for whatever reason. There's always a certain amount of churning. What COVID did is, like, between 2020 and 2022, it just sped up 5 or 6 years of churning into like a year and a half, 2 years. So all that churning that happened in 2 years, that normally happens in 5 or 6 years, meant that you basically have this pause for 4 years. Right. You see what I'm saying? So assuming interest rates start to come down, maybe hopefully like next year, and you get into this next churning cycle, then you would likely see a more healthy real estate market.
Do you think that with people coming back into the city after COVID, came to an end, that might lead to more public support for housing development, or like have we seen more public support?
No, because well, yes and no. I mean, the housing prices and the housing affordability crisis gets worse each year. Mm-hmm. So, like Adams, to his credit, and is pushing an agenda to say, look, we can't keep going with this housing affordability crisis. I think it was about a year ago, Governor Hochul tried to promote a statewide pro-housing reform by having, allowing more apartment buildings along transit lines and things like this, but they got voted down, and so the suburbs basically killed it. So again, the forces. There's this always ever-going there's this ongoing tension between the realization that the housing affordability crisis is not going away, and so we need to build more, or we need to come up with strategies to make sure there's available, low and moderate income units, versus the fact that it's really hard to build these new units because either the zoning restrictions, neighborhood pushback, or just the general, the delay. It takes a very long time. If you have a nice plot of land, and even if you wanted to make it affordable, so if you want to make it all affordable, there's all these tax credits you can get, but you have to go through many hoops to get this. So building something, taking advantage of tax credits and programs just to make the whole building an affordable building for let's say all the residents are like below 80% of the median neighborhood income. That might take 4 or 5 years, but just to get all the papers signed. Mm-hmm. Then it's another 3 or 4 years to assemble the land and build. So it could be 10 years just to build affordable housing.
Sure. Do you think that the migrant crisis has accelerated the problem at all, or was
that's a good question. I can't really say, just because it's not something I really looked into. It doesn't help. I mean, certainly when you have an influx of low-income people trying to get access to scarce low-income housing, it's certainly going to make it worse. So from my reading of it, I wouldn't say it's the cause of the affordable problem, but on the margins, it certainly hasn't made life easier for everyone. It hasn't made life easier.
Do you think that the mandatory low-income housing policies that they've put into place when building like new high-rise buildings and skyscrapers like on the lower floors, do you think that that's been effective, or are there too many
Well, it depends what you mean by effective. I mean, it's in theory, it's a good idea in the sense that it's neighborhoods should have a certain diversity. I mean, people get their back up about Billionaires Row. I personally don't think the problem is as bad as everyone thinks, but nonetheless, if you start building a lot of tall buildings in a neighborhood, it's a good idea to make sure you preserve the neighborhood to have mixed incomes and things like this. So in that sense, when you have a mandatory inclusionary housing policy that has certain units set aside for low-income people, it's good for the neighborhood, it's good for them. But it's not in any way, shape, or form a viable solution to the housing affordability problem. They have lotteries for these units. So they'll put up, they'll put into the they'll make available maybe like 50 units, let's say. There'll be like 5,000, 10,000 people. Okay, so when you have 50 units and 5,000 people signing up, it tells you that there's a tremendous mismatch. Do you see what I'm saying?
It's like applying to college now.
Yeah, it's just a lottery, and so you can't solve a housing affordability problem by having lotteries, because a lottery by nature is you have some prize and a ton of people who want to get that prize. The way to get out of the housing affordability problem is basically, like I keep saying, convert single and two-family houses, to add a few units here, build apartment buildings, 5, 6, 7, 10-story apartment buildings along all the subway lines. Basically go out into the suburbs and things like this. Build, just add more units everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then can I ask you, how do air rights make zoning more flexible? Because I know, for example, on the west side, it's relatively flat, but recently I saw a high-rise building going up there, Was that zoned in one way and they purchased surrounding air rights and they could build higher?
Exactly. So what zoning does, it caps what's called the floor area ratio, the amount of buildable floor space. It's essentially the amount of, so each lot has a cap on how much floor area it could build. Mm-hmm. So let's say you have a 10,000 square foot lot with a maximum floor area ratio, FAR, of 3. That means you could build 30,000 square feet. Mm-hmm. So you have a 10,000 square foot lot with a maximum allowable FAR of 3. Mm-hmm. All right. That means you could build up to 30,000 square feet. Make sense?
Right.
3 times the lot area. Mm-hmm. So especially in places like Manhattan, the maximum allowable FAR could be 10. So if you have a 10,000 square foot building, 10,000 square foot lot, you could build a 100,000 square foot building. Now, but if you build 150,000 square foot, you can make a ton of money.
Right.
So there are older buildings like next door or around you that, let's say they can have 10 FAR if they wanted it, but they have 4 FAR now. They could have 10, but they don't want to build. It's fine. So they have 4, they could have 10. So that means they have 6
up for grabs.
Up for grabs.
Right.
So the guy next door, he comes knocking on the door. He says, "You got 6 FAR up for grabs. Let me buy it." Mm-hmm. And I just buy it, and I add that extra FAR to my building. Mm-hmm. So that's what the air rights are.
How does the city restrict floor to area ratio? That's part of the zoning?
That's exactly right. So you got the maps. You just look up at the maps, and it'll tell you exactly every lot has a maximum FAR, and it has a specified use. So it'll say this is a residential area, and here's the maximum residential FAR. This is a commercial area. Here's the maximum commercial FAR. So that's how the city separates uses, and caps building densities. There's 2 things in the maps. There's other things in the maps, but that's the basic 2 big principles.
So is that the reason why, if you look at the city, I guess from an aerial view, you see a lot of tall buildings in Lower Manhattan, and then a drop, and then in Midtown? I used to think it was because of the bedrock, that it was more accessible.
Okay, this to me, it's hilarious that you bring this up, because I've spent many years actually doing some research on this. Mm-hmm. So here's the story. You want to hear the story? I'll tell you the story. In 1968, a geologist, so zoning comes in later, right? Mm-hmm. So the story goes back to 1968, when a geologist wrote a book and he observed that very phenomena. And he said, oh, well, the bedrock in Greenwich Village is really deep below the ground, and because it's harder to anchor tall buildings where bedrock is really deep below the ground, therefore we must conclude that there are no tall buildings in Greenwich Village because of the bedrock. Mm-hmm. Okay, he was a geologist, and to be honest, when it came to his economics, he didn't know what he was talking about. So he confused correlation with causation. So I wrote a research paper on this. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was going on. Mm-hmm. So the long and the short of it is, first of all, in Lower Manhattan, the geology is pretty crappy. But they built tall buildings, even though there's bad geology there, because the income was so high. The offices were there and stuff like this. But then when you got north of City Hall, the geology is really bad, but those were the densest neighborhoods on the planet. Same with Greenwich Village, very dense tenement districts, Lower East Side dense tenement districts. Mm-hmm. So they didn't build tall buildings there. It had nothing to do with the geology. It had to do with the fact that there was no economic demand for tall buildings. But then once you get north of 14th Street, the economic demand picked up again for various reasons.
So when there's a will, there's a way.
Exactly. Okay. That's exactly the story. So people think, oh, it's because of geology. It has nothing to do with geology. It has simply to do with economic demand. Mm-hmm. And the desire to have tall buildings in different locations in the city. And there was none in the tenement districts of Manhattan, in the early 1900s. Now, then zoning comes along. Zoning and landmarking come along in the 60s. And Greenwich Village, so those apartment buildings or the tenements or the apartment buildings, they might have actual FARs of like 3.5 or 4, but the legal FAR now was to move it down like a couple of notches. So if an apartment building has an FAR 4, The 1961 zoning codes would say any new building that comes along it has to have an FAR of, let's say, 3.5. So that's why it's the way it is now, because everything that was there in 1961 was frozen, and anything going forward had to be a little bit less dense than what was there before. So, I mean, they pocket rezone different neighborhoods and stuff like that from time to time.
I don't know that. I always thought it was because of the bedrock.
Yeah, but no, please. Actually, it's so funny you should say this. I got an email just this very day from a geologist saying, I read your blog post on this, and I realized that's right, it was economics. And so to this day, there are a lot of geologists who still believe there was bedrock. Has nothing to do with it.
I do want to use this to shift towards New Manhatta, and then we certainly have a lot more questions about skyscrapers afterwards. But the reason I wanted to ask is because considering building out the city lower, does that impact the types of buildings that you can build upwards?
No. Again, the geology doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter from like being a barrier. It might propose certain economic costs. So think about Battery Park City. There's a lot of tall buildings there. And actually, One World Trade Center and the Twin Towers, that was all on made land. That land didn't exist when the Europeans first settled Lower Manhattan. So the engineering of foundations, and you know, Waterside, I think it's called Waterside Plaza. It's over on the East River.
Yes. Is it the park that they're putting up?
No, it's four or five apartment towers on the East River. I think it's around 23rd Street or something like this.
Above the FDR.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's built on landfill. Battery Park City is landfill. Much of Lower Manhattan, all those skyscrapers at the lower tip of Manhattan next to the Battery, that's all landfill. The Battery didn't exist. The Battery Park didn't exist when Europeans first came to New York. So there are skyscrapers, there are buildings of every shape and size over land that didn't exist. So the geology is pretty straightforward. There's two ways to do this. You could do piles, where you could just bang, usually like concrete piles, into the riverbed until the friction, it depending on the material of the riverbed. But you could bang piles and you put some kind of like some mat on there, and then you can build up. Or if you could drill those piles to the bedrock, all the better. But the geology of building, I should say the engineering of building over made land is not part of the equation. It's not part of the barrier. It's not a barrier. It's not really going to stop.
Well, considering the historical precedent even within New York City, and certainly in other countries, I think in Netherlands there are a ton of reclamation projects.
Yeah.
I'm curious why the public had such varying opinions on New Manhattan, and like why it's seen as so
very is generous. I mean, I would say 80% of them got some real visceral reaction against it.
Is it primarily like the cost aspect of it?
Well, again, let's just look at all the elements that this proposal is offering and how it runs into all these different things that we have come to believe make it bad idea. Okay, so again, I don't know if you're familiar, how many familiar are this guy Robert Moses, right? Robert Moses, the master builder. So he has a reputation for true or for false, which is I won't go into because Robert Moses is a very controversial figure. But the legacy for true or for false is that he destroyed New York. He plowed the Cross Bronx Expressway through the South Bronx. He built all these, he had his hand in all these public housing projects. He built all these highways, and there was a lot of slum clearance, and people were forced out of their neighborhoods. Lincoln Center, for example, that I don't know if you ever saw the movie West Side Story. It was an immigrant community, it was a low-income community, and then they clear everybody out so they could build Lincoln Center. So this idea of clearing people out and doing these slum clearance projects, building highways through neighborhoods, very controversial. So the legacy of Robert Moses is, we can't build stuff because it's bad. That's how people see big projects today. Robert Moses did it and it's bad. It's just a kind of a knee-jerk reaction. That's not to say Robert Moses You know, I'm not defending everything he did. I'm just saying the legacy is that Robert Moses was sort of like his own political entity. Like nobody could get rid of him. He was in power for for about 30, almost 30 years, and he did what he wanted to do, and and that was whether people wanted it or not, and stuff like this. Mm-hmm. So the legacy of Robert Moses was big projects, bad from New York. So New Manhatta, big project, Robert Moses, therefore it's bad. Yeah. So that's one of them. The other one, again, is Billionaires Row. Oh, we're just going to build all this land and Hudson Yards. Again, the Hudson Yards perpetuates this idea that these now tower neighborhoods are only for, global corporations or billionaires. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be that way if you build out my project.
And I think even Mayor Bloomberg had a similar idea when it comes to reclamation projects. I'm curious, why did he never push that through, or why was that idea?
Again, it's just too controversial. I mean, it was a good idea, so Battery Park. If you look at the Hurricane Sandy flooding maps from 2012, you'll notice that Battery Park City was relatively spared in terms of the flooding. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what got me onto this. Like, you can build new land and not necessarily be subject to flooding. Anyway, so Bloomberg proposed something in 2013 after Hurricane Sandy, and it just was too controversial. And then there's the huge environmental issue. Yeah. So part of the controversy is, you build into the harbor, you're wrecking the environment. The Europeans and when the Europeans settled, the first thing they did was wreck the environment. There is no environment left in Lower Manhattan. Mm-hmm. It's been destroyed. Right. So I'm not proposing destroying anything. I'm proposing recreating it. If we could recreate wetlands, we could recreate beaches, we can put in native species. You can actually use this opportunity to increase the biodiversity, the plant life and the animal life in New York by actually recreating these wetlands that were actually destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Was the escape from flooding what inspired you to propose New Manhatta?
A part of it, right. So think about it. Yes, in part. So number one is when I looked at Battery Park City, I was like, that's made land. That didn't get flooded. It's possible to do this. Then, you just think about the housing problem, preserving Lower Manhattan, Wall Street. The water came 13 feet into Lower Manhattan and just went down into the subway stops, and so if you build it correctly, which is not that difficult to do engineering-wise, you create a higher elevation, you buffer Lower Manhattan, create new housing, and you actually keep the new land relatively safe because it's both at a higher elevation and uses techniques like new wetlands that could absorb storm surges and things like that.
So you would say most people's objections don't have much weight to them besides purely symbolism, like the financial aspect of it. I believe you talked about how eventually it would pay itself off.
If it was done wisely, it would pay for itself many times over because remember, land values in Manhattan are so high. People want to be in Manhattan. They're willing to pay hard coin. That hard coin. Remember, let's say I said create a here's the thing. If you I propose 1,760 acres, and let's say you have an average FAR of 3, you're basically creating 3 times more land, and the cost per square foot of selling the land, 3 times the amount of that, is on a per square foot basis is likely higher than the square foot cost of actually building it. Mm-hmm. So just the selling of the real estate, just creating the real estate and selling it or renting it will generate tons of revenue that would pay for the creation of this thing.
And do you believe that there should be some kind of policy regulation in place to make sure that there's more inclusive housing?
But that's the whole thing. So if Battery Park City is owned by the Battery Park City Authority, they sell ground leases. Mm-hmm. So my idea would be simple: you create this new land, and there's one city authority that owns it, and then they can issue the ground leases. And so every plot that's the ground leases are. The ground leases is the right to develop a building on a plot, but the developer doesn't own the land. The developer just owns the right to develop the property. Mm-hmm. And so the rules of the ground lease specify, okay, you have so many units of low-income housing. I mean, think about the Upper West Side. I don't know how much time you've traveled up the West Side. It's a very diverse and vibrant neighborhood. My idea is let's just recreate that. and if you create that much square footage, there's tons of square footage for everybody.
Right. Logistically speaking, I'm just fascinated. How do you build out a landmass? Is it sand that's poured in?
Yeah, you create some kind of retaining wall, maybe like concrete barrier, and then you got to get your fill. So
all the way down to the ocean, to the.
Well, you have you create a retaining wall around, that goes sort of embedded into the riverbed,
How deep is it? Like, let's say between Governor's Island and the tip of Manhattan.
Well, I think my proposal is it goes like 2 miles into something. I want to say it's 2 miles long.
No, I mean depth of the.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, however deep it is. I don't know, 30 or 40 feet deep. I mean,
okay.
That's not like a.
Oh, okay. I was thinking hundreds of feet you'd have to.
Oh, I don't know how deep the riverbed is, honestly. Having said that, I don't think it's that deep. I mean, they're dredging they're dredging channels. The Port Authority is dredging channels all the time. So, the fact that they have to dredge for bigger and bigger ships shows you that the difference between where the bottom of the boat is and where the bottom of the seabed is, it's not that far down.
Interesting.
So I don't know the exact depth, but to build these retaining walls, again, if you spend just a little bit of time, you could see Singapore, Hong Kong, China, all over Asia. They've been doing this for decades. 1/3 of Hong Kong's developed land is reclaimed land, is made land, because Hong Kong is very mountainous. And so all the economic activity happens along the shore. So basically you have the coast and then you have mountains. So the way Hong Kong grew is just expanding the shoreline outward. So yeah, you just build these retaining walls and then you just got to get the fill. Where you get the fill,
what is the fill? Soil?
Yeah, well, it would probably be like dredge material, So like the Port Authority, my idea is ports like Port of New York and ports all over the country, they're always dredging. So there's a huge amount of fill. So in theory, I don't know if this is practical or not, but in theory, why not just go on the open market and buy dredged sea bottom from all the ports in the United States?
So I think that we had a few questions that I guess are on a larger scale that we wanted to ask you. Did I miss anything that we wanted to touch on?
No, I think basically went over.
Yeah. So when we look at a lot of the buildings from the past, we could look a few hundred years back and we see a lot of marvelous pieces of engineering. And then I guess there's the general idea that today things aren't built to last. Like your phone, you're meant to trade in quickly. Vehicles don't last as long. Is this a concern for the skyscrapers of today?
No, and first of all, there's building regulations. So your building has to be safe, it has to be durable, it has to be fireproof. Most buildings today are made of concrete. I mean, so as long as you maintain these buildings, reasonably maintain the buildings, they can last and last and last. You may have to replace the facade every 25 years or something like that. So primarily buildings have to be safe and weatherproof and all of this kind of thing. So this puts like a stop on how much in terms of the safety, they can last forever. The amount of turnover or how much decay a building has over time, that's a social idea. That's kind of like so in the old days in Lower East Side, the way these would work is you'd have some immigrant family come over from wherever, they'd buy a piece of land, they'd put up an apartment building. After 15 years, so they get a high rents when they put it up, and then each year the rent, each few years the rents would decay because apartment buildings, they just wear down quickly, and then so the rents would fall, but the maintenance would fall, and then at some point the maintenance and the rents fell so low they just knock it down and start over and over again. So
they would knock the building down.
Yeah. So I would say, if anything, the apartment buildings that were built a century ago were designed to be more disposable than the buildings that are completed today. simply because well, there's less building, and so there's a lot less turnover. The more the more building you have, the more you're going to tear down the older buildings and build new ones. So I don't know if that gets to your question or not.
No, it does.
But from a safety point of view, buildings are built to last. The problem is not so much the safety; it's really just the taste and the preferences. So as technology changes, you want your buildings to have different layouts. You want different, the different wiring or things like this, and so and you want different architectural styles. So it's really the changing society and the changing tastes and the preferences. That's what caused buildings to change.
Mm-hmm. And our second question was, do you see network effects within skyscrapers? So if we take Midtown Manhattan, for example, if a certain developer puts up a ton of buildings, is the goal to have them interconnected, people living and working within the same buildings, walking over sky bridges, or should they exist as independent entities?
So you're saying, like, what should the city of the future look like?
I guess, in your mind.
Well, I think, so we have to think about vibrancy. I think streets we want people on the streets, but the idea of people crossing bridge, Hong Kong has made an art of sky bridges, and so I think the ideal city is a 3D city where you can go up, you can go across, you can go down. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really an issue of trying to accommodate the more people. The more people you have, the more just general vibrancy there is. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but we shouldn't be afraid of the skyscraper because people are afraid. They think somehow it's sucking the life off the street. But if you have many people living, if you have a neighborhood building, not a billionaire's row neighborhood, but many of these neighborhood buildings here in downtown Brooklyn that are at least 70% or 80% occupied. I mean, these are people stacked on top of each other, and they go down, they go on the street, and so that's the kind of thing. By stacking people, you're automatically creating a market, for people on the street and the restaurants and the local services and things like this. So, density is good for the city. So I think we should. Density and mobility are the two key things to make cities the most vibrant. So if it's horizontal and if it's in the sky bridges, that's fine too. If it increases mobility and gets people, I want to go from point A to point B, and I can do it this way through a sky bridge, all the better.
Mm-hmm. Right. And how about adding on to this question, outdoor green spaces? So like we have the spiral close to Hudson Yards.
Right.
Is that something good that people are building parks into skyscrapers, or is that something that's just frivolous?
No. I think there's a huge demand for this now, and I think it's good. I mean, so the more green space we can incorporate the buildings, I think is a great thing. It's expensive. In Singapore, there's a new rule that every new so let's say you have a 10,000 square foot lot. Every new building, let's say on a 10,000 square foot, has to have 10,000 square feet of green space somewhere. Wow. Now, remember that Singapore is literally like 70 miles to the equator. So it's literally like 80 degrees, 90 degrees all year round, and so you could do all kinds of green space. But remember, what COVID did was it got people thinking more about removing these boundaries between indoors and outdoors. But they're expensive to maintain, and these kind of outdoor gardens are expensive to maintain and to keep going all year long. But so right now they're more, I guess they're more just sort of showcase pieces. But again, I think the idea of again mobility, density, and blurring the line between inside and outside. I think that all these are fun things that would really enhance the quality of life. So the more that buildings can get involved with producing green space, outdoor spaces, I think it would enhance vitality to the city.
Is there anything else that you see in other cities or maybe other countries that you think could have a place in New York as well?
Well, I mean, I would start with the subway and transportation. I mean, I was coming over here. I was like, I think it was on the A train. Okay, first of all, I tried to get here on the F train, but I couldn't because there was some big sign saying the F train was delayed because blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, all right, I'll take the A train. Then I got on the A train, and like the floor, it's like warped and dirty. You spend 5 minutes in any city in the rest of the world, whether it's in Europe or Asia, it's clean, It operates on time. It can take you anywhere. I feel like if we could just get New Yorkers spending, one day in some other city to ride the subway, there'd be a revolution. There'd be shouting on the streets. I mean, this is the richest city on the planet, and we don't deserve such a crap-ass subway system.
Did you see congestion pricing as a solution for the MTA? Because I believe those funds were...
Yeah, I mean, is it the only solution, or is it like the solution? No, but it definitely would have provided a ton of money for dramatically needed upgrades.
Right.
An improvement in service. I mean, you need more money to operate these systems, and you can generate these positive feedbacks. The more money to upgrade, the more riders you have, the more money you have, and So exactly, killing congestion pricing. It was just basically saying, the governor basically saying, I don't care about subway system in New York.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it was a political move?
Absolutely, 100%. Again, there's no unknowns about the operation of the system. It's been done in Singapore. It's been done in London. It's done in Stockholm. It's done wherever. For decades. It's a known entity. They know what the prices are. They know how many cars are going to be off the street. They know how much air pollution is being reduced. They know how much traffic speeds are going to rise for the cars that actually pay the fee. They know how much money they're going to generate for upgrades to the other transportation system. But there's a bunch of people who really don't want to pay that $15 for the luxury to drive into Manhattan. And those are the ones who she listened to.
I think, like you're saying, like the subway in New York is one of those things that a lot of New Yorkers just take as a given. Like, oh, we're in New York, of course, like the subway is going to run poorly and there's going to be errors like that. Do you think that there's anything else that people can look at in other cities if they were to visit and come home and be like stunned? Like, why doesn't New York have this stuff?
Well, there's a lot of cities that are clean. We should work on make sure that the streets are clean. I really think we should just first, the biggest problem is just getting more housing in every neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Affordable housing or just housing in general?
Well, the two things become one and the same when you do it everywhere. Yeah, sir, New York, Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn, they may need some kind of mandatory inclusionary thing if you want to have a diverse income. But when you're out in Queens, when you're out in the Bronx, these are either immigrant neighborhoods, they're middle-class neighborhoods. So adding more units in middle-class neighborhoods, these are not where the gentrifiers are moving to. They're people that want to live in that neighborhood because of their friends are in that neighborhood or they like that neighborhood. So if those places started adding apartment units or ADUs, you'd see a lot more affordable units. I mean, just to convert a garage into an apartment, it's affordable, right? It's 400 square feet. You got a bed, you got a kitchen, and it's out in nowhere. So you maybe rent it for $800 a month. That same space in Midtown Manhattan would be $2,800 a month.
So it's a matter of zoning and regulation that allows the housing market to open up a little bit.
Exactly, yeah.
Do you think that the city should put in some kind of incentives into place to make sure that, like, for example, all new housing builds should have a certain amount of units or like anything like that?
Well, okay, so this is a hard question to answer, but here's the thing, the other thing that you have to consider. If, let's say you build a new apartment building next to a subway stop, somewhere like, in the Bronx, who's going to live in that apartment? It's going to be people who are probably from that neighborhood who want to upgrade. So they're leaving their apartment buildings. Who's going to move into that apartment building that was vacated? People who are in the neighborhood but want to upgrade from housing that's worse than they had. So if you start dumping a ton of new buildings for that neighborhood, it's just going to automatically loosen up the housing market locally. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And if you loosen up the housing market locally, then the prices are going to stay. They're not going to shoot up. They're going to basically, remain reasonable. Again, it's the vacancy issue. If you can get that neighborhood through new construction to loosen up enough units so that the total neighborhood vacancy is 5 or 6%, you solve the housing affordability problem. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you got to focus in the neighborhoods that are not going to be gentrifying, that are basically going to be attracting people who are in the community already. Maybe it's going to draw in, so maybe if you have an ethnic enclave, maybe it's going to draw in more people from that foreign country to this one. But if you build rapidly enough, and add like schools and parks and amenities at the same time, this is the lesson of Tokyo, which is if you just keep adding units, eventually the supply has to outstrip the demand, But it's a huge hurdle to overcome. All right, so.
Fantastic. I think that we have just 2 more questions.
All right.
So the first one is there a limit to how tall a skyscraper can be built physically, if money was no object?
Okay, so the question is whether you could probably like just keep pouring concrete and keep just adding floors to the moon. I mean, I don't know, but it's really about the cost of making it habitable. And so, right now we're looking at when the Jeddah Tower is completed, that's going to be probably let me back up here. The Burj Khalifa is 828 meters. It's probably about 650 meters occupied. So, let's say you can probably create close to, but not exactly 1 kilometer today of habitable height. Then if you want to go up to a mile, which is like 1.6 kilometers, then you start adding things like air pressure issues and things like that. And so that's going to make it more expensive because you got to pressurize the whole building to have the same air. So when you go on the ground floor, it's like New York, and then you come out on the top floor, it's like Denver, because you're 1 mile up. So there are, and the elevator cable is probably not very efficient in moving you a mile. So those are the barriers. I mean, I don't think the actual just building the floors is a big deal. It's really about how do you make a mile-high building, for example, comfortable and have the elevators move quickly that you can get up from the ground floor to 1 mile in the air in like less than 2 minutes or something like that. So
a feasible speed.
So the thing is, so if you look at the trajectory of building heights, the buildings grow. The highest buildings grow on average like at 1.2% a year, smooth. So if you just take that trajectory out, the doubling time for building heights is like, let's say 60 years or something like this. So if today the tallest building is, the tallest occupied floor is like 700 kilometers, in 60 years it'll be, it'll be easy enough to do like a mile high. But you just got to sort of keep adding the new technologies needed to just overcome the barriers to going a little bit taller and taller and taller. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I don't know what the actual practical height is, but nobody's tried to figure it out yet because nobody's really asked to build something taller than 1 kilometer at this point. There are some proposals for a 2 kilometer building, but I don't think anyone really thinks that's really a realistic project.
The future is exciting.
It'll get there. Yeah. The mile high, we will get there. Because if you just look at the trajectory of technology over time, each barrier is overcome. It sets the seeds for the next kind of round of
like
height.
Moore's law.
Yeah, but it doesn't. Moore's law is like an exponential thing. This is more like kind of like, well, maybe it's exponential, but it's more like, you could add 20% more to the tallest building and it works. Then the next one, maybe you can add another 20%. So Moore's law is like doubling every, 5 years or something. Right. This is more like 20% every 10 years or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that kind of growth on growth is there. It's just not as rapid as like a Moore's law, but it's there. And like I said, it's probably like 1.5% a year on average, or 15% every 10 years or something like that. Is that, yeah.
Dave, do you want to take the last one?
Sure. So we were also wondering if there was a particular building that was your favorite, and maybe hear your reasoning as to why.
Well, I think, the more research I do, I keep having a renewed appreciation for the Empire State Building. The history of it is really a fascinating history. It got all this sort of bad publicity when it opened. But those guys, they knew what they were doing. So here's a couple of things. First of all, it opened up during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was not something anybody could have foreseen. The Great Depression coming was like the pandemic coming. Nobody knew it. So to hold those guys to the standard of that is just a false standard. But when they were crunching the numbers, it made sense. It actually was a profitable building. The other thing is they cooked up this mooring mast idea. So Chrysler was building his Chrysler building, on 42nd Street. And they say, oh, we want to be a little bit taller than him. So they're like, let's just put this mooring mast. And we can imagine a world where these airships, they come from Europe and they dock on the top of the mooring mast at the top of the Empire State Building. And people get out of the airship, they get their luggage, they go down the elevator, and then they go on their way. So I don't know if they believe that or not, but they put it up there basically to add the height. But then they had an airship try a test run, and it didn't work, so they never used it. But the thing is, building the mooring mast meant that you actually had this object on the roof. Well, if you have something on the roof, you now actually have space for an observatory. So this add-on of the mooring mast, just to beat Chrysler, actually gave them the idea to create the observatory, which turns out to be like one of the best things about that building. So the competition made it a better building because architecturally, the mooring mast adds a certain amount of, elegance to it, and it also created a more profitable building. So one of the things I really like this is, people talk about ego and high competition and just being wasteful, but it was actually the high competition that made the Empire State Building a much better building, architecturally speaking and profitably speaking. And it was the world's tallest building for 40 years. And every city today that has a skyline, they want their own version of the Empire State Building. So those are the reasons why I find the Empire State Building so fascinating.
Well said.
That's great.
Well, that's everything we had planned.
All right,
of course,
awesome.
Thank you for coming by.
Sure.
We really appreciate it.
Yeah, lots of fun. I love talking about this stuff. So.
Well, we do too. I think we both learned a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Alrighty, thank you.